Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We're talking politics with Ben Domenech, The Federalist, Shauna Thomas of Vice News, CBS News' own Ed O'Keefe, and the Wall Street Journal's Nancy Youssef. Shauna, we heard from Professor Turley of George Washington University, constitutional law professor, say a porn star may actually take down the presidency. That is an incredible statement.
Yes, it is an incredible statement. I think it's also, some of it, we hear that statement. You had Jonathan Turley on, you had Kellyanne Conway on, in some ways because Rudy Giuliani went on Fox News this week. From a PR perspective, I mean, he gave more attention, he gave more sort of fire to, or put, more wood on the fire of the Stormy Daniels thing, which is something that the White House clearly doesn't want to talk about, but he made it impossible not to talk about it.
And, the president authorized him to talk about it.
The president authorized him to talk about it, that's true, but Rudy Giuliani is supposed to be his lawyer, is supposed to protect him, and it doesn't seem like that is what he was doing. And whether the president authorizes you or not, his legal duty is sort of to be like, hey, this is what's best for you, this is not what's best for you. And that's not really what happened. So we're not talking unemployment numbers, we're not talking other things that President Trump may actually want to tout this week because Giuliani re-legitimized this conversation this week.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, one of the things that it was clear from speaking to Kellyanne Conway, she was not comfortable as someone who works at the White House talking about the fate of these 3 Americans being held in North Korea. Rudy Giuliani, however, has said that's imminent. There are literally lives on the line here. He's talking about that.
And it actually created a bit of confusion. I was talking to a U.S. official today to try to confirm it, and they said you have to call Rudy Giuliani, who's not part of the national security team, or doesn't have the clearance to sort of give any insights on this. And so we know that those 3 Americans have been moved to the Capitol, which suggests that it's imminent, but in terms of how these announcements happen, it's usually a little bit more formal than that, because when you hear that, if you're a family member, that sets all sorts of emotions and feelings into action. And from the military perspective, it was hard to understand whether the military was prepared potentially to fly them out, what the intelligence community was doing about it. So it created an air of confusion. And at a time when we're potentially talking about some very serious talks with North Korea, if it happens, it appears to be an intent of goodwill by the North Koreans ahead of these key talks.
You also had Rudy Giuliani tear up yesterday a piece of paper claiming this is what the president was going to do with the Iran deal. That decision's coming this week. Was he freelancing on that?
Not as much from we can tell, given the statements by Secretary of State Pompeo, by some of the more recent statements by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. We've heard from them repeatedly that if the president doesn't see the terms as he'd like to see them, then the deal is over. Essentially, the message is that the president feels that the Iranians have gotten too much relief of sanctions for too little insights and drawdown of their nuclear weapons program. They basically, and so that's sort of the tension that's there. And they're saying that they want to see a more permanent agreement, one that deals with the ballistic missile program, and one that deals with Iran's nefarious activities in countries like Syria and Yemen and Iraq. The problem is it's not clear that the Iranians are interested in having any sort of side agreements to the one that was reached in 2015. And so the challenge becomes, if this is torn up, or as Giuliani suggested, or there are some efforts to play with it, for example, to bring back some of the sanctions, that essentially would end the deal anyway. And so it's created a lot of ambiguity. And I think it's one of the reasons we saw the call between Trump and Theresa May of the UK. We've seen the visit from Macron of France and Chancellor Merkel before, because this is not just a bilateral agreement between Iran and the United States. This is one that potentially affects all the signatories.
And we'll be talking about that ahead with the UK ambassador. Ed, you are headed to West Virginia shortly. Tell me about the kind of primaries we should be expecting.
Well, this week we really start to see points get put up on the board across the country, because there are primaries ahead of the midterm elections. Most notably this week, West Virginia, North Carolina, Indiana. We're focused on the West Virginia race because you have a 5-way Republican primary to take on Joe Manchin, who many would argue is the most vulnerable Democrat this year, just given how popular the president is in West Virginia. And there is reason to believe that the leading candidate is a former coal mining executive who served time in a federal prison on a misdemeanor charge related to the deadly Upper Big Branch mine disaster in 2010. He's running away with it, some suggest, because he has this sort of anti-Washington, pro-Trump, businessman, not politician message.
Very sharply anti-Mitch McConnell,
Absolutely.
Republican leadership.
He has floated some inaccurate statements about the Senate leader, all of it designed to sort of stir up the same kind of anti-Washington, anti-Republican establishment sentiment that exists across the country. Given that it's a crowded primary, there's a good chance he wins this, and various Republican groups have said if he is the nominee, they're not really going to worry about the West Virginia race.
But Ben, one of the questions is not just the message being anti-Washington, but that it's flat out racist. Some of the ads that Don Blankenship has run are referencing Secretary Chao and her family and their ethnicity. And this has been matched in articles by Breitbart suggesting certain things having to do with their ties to China as well. What is this reflecting within conservative politics?
I think it reflects the dissatisfaction among a lot of different cohorts for the job that the Republican Congress has done. There's a reason that Speaker Ryan is stepping down.
But that's not policy; it's personal.
No, I think it's personal. It's policy. It's everything. I think that they believe that the Republican Congress has failed to live up to its obligation to deliver policy for President Trump. I think that they are highlighting those criticisms in all sorts of different primaries, and I think this is just, frankly, the beginning of this. We're going to see a number of races play out this way, in a way where there are candidates who boost their own approval ratings, not because they are actually good candidates, but because they have a very pointed and direct criticism of people like Mitch McConnell, who, frankly, Republicans in a lot of different states do not like and do not believe has lived up to his obligation to deliver for the president.
I mean, it is in some ways run against the swamp playbook. You know, you have liberals who run against Nancy Pelosi, like progressives. So there's a similarity there. But the dog whistling in these ads is not something that can be ignored.
I'm not sure it's a dog whistle.
Well, okay, so fine. So it's a full-out whistle.
Yes.
And I think there is something to be said for if our politics is moving in that direction and the Republican Party puts up a nominee against Joe Manchin who is using that kind of language, who is trying to incite that kind of feeling within people, what does that mean for the Republican Party going forward? And in some ways, Don Blankenship winning this race is probably Joe Manchin's dream in terms of him being, as you said, one of the most vulnerable senators in the Senate.
Ted Cruz thought he was going to run a campaign based on the Constitution. Instead, he had to fight off attacks that his wife was ugly and that his dad killed JFK. We're in sort of through the looking glass on this sort of thing.
Yeah.
It was pretty staggering. Another development in the state of Iowa, Ed, this week, the governor there imposed a 6-week abortion ban.
Strictest in the country. Again, another example of, and she's somebody who faces potentially a difficult re-election this year. Actually, election, because she's filling out a term from the former governor who's now the U.S. ambassador to China. This is something that, you know, we're going to see through the summer, different kinds of policy arguments made in different states on issues like this in a bid to build up the base of support. But on the flip side, this very well could infuriate voters in Iowa and drive out Democrats or independents who are concerned about this. That's a state, along with several others in the Midwest, where I think you're going to see state houses, governorships potentially flip or be far more competitive than Republicans might have thought. It's partly anti-Trump. It's partly also just a belief that there's got to be some divided government.
Nancy, one of the things that the president would like to put on the board as a win before November, or just for his presidency, is this agreement with North Korea. He says date and time have been set. What are you hearing?
So Yonhap Agency is reporting that the location will be in Singapore just before the G7 summit in Quebec. That hasn't been confirmed by U.S. officials yet, but it was one place that we had heard in addition to the DMZ. The disadvantage of the DMZ from some people's perspective was that it was going to Kim Jong-un's turf rather than a sort of more neutral territory. So we're starting to hear leaks of these kinds of things, and I think that's how it's going to be up until the talks themselves, because this isn't the kind of talk that we saw with the Iran deal where people at lower levels were working out every little detail such that at the end the big players that came in and signed it. This is the exact opposite, that things are going to come from Kim Jong-un or Trump, and it'll be for people afterwards to sort out.
And can you clarify, because there were some conflicting statements from the defense secretary versus the president on whether troops are on the table?
So I think that the question is, what does the word order mean when we say President Trump ordered? He said many times that he doesn't understand why 28,500 U.S. troops are in South Korea, and maybe it should be lower. We've heard this from defense officials before. And the presumption is that at some point when he has said this, the U.S. military thought, all right, we should have options ready should he want to do a drawdown. And so I think the confusion came about is, can you call that an order? Because it's not in the sort of traditional military terms, but when the commander-in-chief says it, it has to be acted upon. And so if it's on the table, I think realistically what we would see, depending how this goes, presumably it's the best case scenario for all involved, is some kind of drawdown as a signal that it is no longer still a wartime front line, as it still is, technically speaking.
Ben, before we let you go, I want to ask you about the health of your father-in-law, Senator John McCain. How is he doing?
He's doing well. It's always a pleasure to talk about your in-laws on national television. I actually, my wife, Megan, is out there with him this weekend. This is the first weekend, and I think 5 in a row that we haven't been out there with him. He's doing well. He's talking, he's chatty, and he's walking around. Look, this is a terrible disease, and we appreciate all of the support that we've been given by a lot of different folks who've come out and met with him over the past couple of weeks. The family is very thankful for that and thankful for all the prayers and good wishes that we've heard from so many different Americans.
We also heard from him in this recorded message regarding his book. He seems to be very reflective right now.
He is. I mean, you come to the end of your life, and in his case, he's lived the life over and over again of, I think, enough for 5 or 10 different people. He's had a pretty amazing run. The fact is, he's very grateful for the chances and the fortune that he's experienced in life. He's reflecting at the end on a lot of different things, and we just appreciate the fact that we've had such a good time to be able to spend with him in this moment, and we appreciate again all of the support that we've had, not just from doctors and nurses, but also from just well-wishers from across the country.
And I know so many send their thoughts and prayers, Ben. Thank you for sharing that. We will be right back in a moment. We're joined now by the British ambassador to the U.S., Kim Derrick. Welcome to Face the Nation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Mr. Ambassador, your prime minister spoke with President Trump yesterday. Can you tell us if there was a decision made on the nuclear deal with Iran?
Well, I don't have a full account of the discussion. They talked mostly about North Korea. The prime minister congratulating the president on the progress that has been made and asking him about this forthcoming summit. They touched on the Iran deal, but the message we are hearing from all contacts in this administration is that although the president's views on the deal are very clear and have been out there for months and months, actually for years, that a final decision hasn't yet been taken.
And your Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, will be here to lobby, as many of the European allies of the United States have done over the past week. What do you think is the compelling argument at this point? Because, as you said, the president doesn't like the deal, but do you think that you can come up with a side agreement in time for him to avoid putting sanctions on Iran next Saturday?
Well, this is the area that we want to talk about. We think it's a good deal. It's not a perfect deal. No deal ever is perfect. And the president is rightly concerned about Iran's regional activities, which are malign and damaging to security and stability. And he doesn't like the fact that ballistic missiles aren't covered. He's not happy about the sunset clauses. He thinks the inspections regime should be tougher. On those issues, we have ideas. We think that we can find some language, produce some action that meets the president's concerns.
This week, you're ready to close that side agreement this week?
We have been talking at senior official level to the administration with our French and German colleagues for several weeks now. We think we're making progress. We haven't got there yet. We have a few days left to see if we can find a way through.
The president's national security advisor, John Bolton, was on this program last week, and he said, despite all these public statements about his own personal misgivings about the deal, he will still present the president with the option you're working on here. Do you take him at his word?
Absolutely. I know John well. I've talked to him about this. Our own national security advisor was over a week ago talking to him. Absolutely. I mean, as he said to us...
You think you have a fair shot?
We'll give it a shot. He'll give it a shot.
President Macron of France said if this deal is blown up, that it opens a Pandora's box and will spike tensions in the region. Are you prepared for that?
Plan A is that the US stays in the deal, and that's what we're working towards.
But you're a diplomat. You're working on Plan B.
But, of course, we are looking at all the eventualities. My government has said that as long as Iran is in compliance with the deal and wants to stick with it, that will be our position as well. So we're looking at options for maintaining the deal, which we hope they won't, should the US administration choose to withdraw.
I want to ask you, on Friday, the president was speaking at the NRA, and he spoke about a spike in knifings and murders in London. I want to play that bite for you.
I recently read a story that in London, which has unbelievably tough gun laws, a once very prestigious hospital, right in the middle, is like a war zone for horrible stabbing wounds. Yes, that's right. They don't have guns. They have knives. And instead, there's blood all over the floors of this hospital. They say it's as bad as a military war zone hospital. Knives, knives, knives. London hasn't been used to that. They're getting used to it. It's pretty tough.
That was very controversial back home for you. Does this complicate the president's visit?
I don't think it complicates the president's visit. Every country has an issue with knife crime, and so, yes, tackling it in the UK. Actually, we've just introduced, about a year ago, a new strategy on tackling this, and we are consulting at the moment as a government about new legislation to make it even harder for people to acquire the kind of knives that get involved in these crimes. So action is in hand, and the president's right. We do have extraordinarily strong gun laws in the UK, and we will keep them.
Later this month, what all Americans are watching for is this royal wedding. An American, Meghan Markle, will be marrying Prince Harry. What does this mean to the British people to have an American in the family?
I think the British people are thrilled that an American is marrying Prince Harry. I think Meghan Markle has done an extraordinary job since the announcement of the forthcoming wedding. In terms of her public appearances, I think she's already much loved amongst the British people, and I think it's wonderful news, not just for the two of them and for the families, but also for the relationship between the UK and the US. So we're thrilled for it.
We'll be watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sir Derek. We'll be back in a moment. Our next guest, Michael Hayden, is a former director of both the CIA and the National Security Agency. He's also the author of a new book, The Assault on Intelligence, American National Security in an Age of Lies. He's also a principal at the Chertoff Group here in Washington. What do you mean an age of lies?
We have moved into what the Oxford Dictionary describes as a post-truth world. And Margaret, I look at the problem in kind of three layers. And frankly, the first problem is us. It's the broader society. It's our social discourse or lack of social discourse. We're making decisions based not on facts and data, but on emotion, preference, grievance, loyalty, tribalism. We have a president who recognized that as a candidate, exploited it as a candidate, and frankly, I think worsens it as a president by some of the things he says and does. And then finally, we've got a foreign power coming in, recognizing and exploiting both one and two above. And it's all based on our moving away from basing our lives, our decisions, our dialogue on a view of objective reality rather than preference.
Why do you think that this is now coming up? I mean, as an intelligence professional, you've been analyzing these kind of issues around the world. In this book, you talk about advice you've given to other professionals who are considering joining the Trump administration, and you're telling them don't do it. But don't you need more professionals at a time like this?
You do, and I reserve, I kind of take that for only folks at the very highest level, because I don't know that they're going to have much influence. I look at the experience of H.R. McMaster, for example, who tried as hard as he could to connect decision-making to the normal processes of fact-based governance, and I think he left because he failed. Now, I want the other folks, you know, the ones I describe as below decked with an oar, and they should just be rowing. Be there, do your duty. Make this president as successful as you can, but here's the punchline. You have got to preserve not just your integrity, obviously, but you've got to preserve your institution in the face of the pressures that it's under at the present time.
Let me ask you about some of those comments the president has made about the institutions of intelligence. You've taken issue with his very public criticism of the intelligence community, including his repeated reference to the 9/11 attacks, missed signals there, faulty weapons of mass destruction intelligence in Iraq. You were in key intelligence roles at that time. Isn't some of his skepticism warranted?
Absolutely. And I would be the first to tell you, should have done better there. I was in the room when we voted on the weapons of mass destruction national intelligence estimate. But Margaret, that's of a pattern with regard to the president when it comes to decision making, explaining his policies or defending his policies. He doesn't come at you with data. He doesn't come at you with evidence. He comes at you with attempting to delegitimize those who would agree with him. So it's the fake news, the lying media, intelligence with quotes in it, political hacks in terms of John Brennan and Jim Clapper. That's the essence of post-truthism. You don't take the matter on based upon an argument as to what reality is. In fact, reality doesn't matter very much. You just discredit those who disagree with you.
And yet he is trying to appoint a career intelligence official, Gina Haspel, to run the CIA. You've given her a full-throated endorsement there. But I want to ask you, she was chief of base at a CIA black site in Thailand where at least 12 tapes were made of some call it torture, enhanced interrogation techniques. Those were destroyed in 2005. I think you were at the DNI at that point in time. Do you think those tapes should have been destroyed? Because this is a huge issue that could hold up her confirmation.
Yeah. As a matter of policy, it was against guidance. Legally, there were no legal prohibitions against it. But you bring up Gina, and that's a great question. I mean, we can relitigate the past of CIA. We've done that before. But if you want to do that, then it should be directors and attorney generals and members of Congress and presidents. Why I want Gina in there now is based upon the conversation you and I just had. All right? With a president who does not always attach his decisions to the real world, to data, to evidence, Gina Haspel is the one woman I want in that room when everyone else will be going into north-south Autobahn and saying, "You're right, boss." Gina Haspel won't.
She'll be dedicated.
Absolutely not. Her only existence as a professional has been within the agency. Her only goal is to live out the agency's mission, which frankly is to tell the truth to the president, even though most often that makes the president's life less comfortable than it would otherwise be.
Very quickly, will that repair his relationship with the intelligence community?
Her choice, she is a wonderful choice. Now, the question becomes, can she succeed where perhaps HR did not, which was connecting that to the actual decision.
Okay. General Hayden, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching Face the Nation. Next week, we'll be in a new location right next door in our brand new CBS News Washington Bureau. We will have a different look, different feel, different sound, but our tradition won't change. Until then, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.